Hello everybody. My name is Chris Galvin. I'm the head of communications and outreach at the International Code of Conduct Association. Welcome to today's webinar on preventing and addressing sexual exploitation and abuse in private security operations. I want to say thank you to our panelists and just very briefly introduce the panel. We have, first of all, online, not in the room here, but we'll see later, Frank Amoyo, CEO of Landmark Security Limited, which is a private security company in Ghana and an ICoCA member company. Then in the room with me here, we have Lorraine Anson, First Secretary for Legal Affairs at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations here in Geneva. And we have, at the end of the table, Lisa Reilly, who's Executive Director of the European Interagency Security Forum, based in the UK. And next to me is my colleague, Giuseppe Scirocco, Monitoring Officer here at ICoCA. So just a couple of logistics. We will be online until 5 o'clock. We've got 1 hour. We're first going to hear from each of our panelists before we open the session up to questions. This is an interactive session, so we are eager that you do submit questions. The way to do that is if you could please use the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom of your screen, rather than the chat. If you use the Q&A, that makes my life much easier. So, the webinar coincides with the release of the ICoCA publication, which is guidelines for private security providers on preventing and addressing sexual exploitation and abuse. That is this publication. It's available to download on the ICoCA website, which go to icoca.ch. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the government, the UK government, which provided financial support for the production of the guidelines, as well as the US and Canadian governments who provided substantive input. This is actually the second in a series of guidelines produced by ICoCA. The first is available on the website as well, which is a guidance on company grievance mechanisms, and I anticipate that we may well touch on that subject during the conversation today. I thought it might be first useful to provide the definition of sexual exploitation and abuse, which we provide in the guidelines undertaken from the UN. And they read as follows: any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes, including but not limited to profiting monetarily, socially, or politically from the sexual exploitation of another. And it defines sexual abuse as the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or under unequal or coercive conditions. So this is a difficult topic, but it's one that absolutely needs tackling head on. It's not a new issue, but what is perhaps somewhat new is the attention that it's now receiving. Last year, the UK aid sector experienced a wake-up call with revelations of sexual exploitation and abuse occurring in the sector, and in 2002, the UN itself was put in the spotlight as evidence reported on extensive sexual exploitation of refugee children in West Africa. So, what's that got to do with private security companies? Well, to help us answer the question, I want to first turn to Giuseppe. Giuseppe led the development of these guidelines, and so it would be great if you could tell us about why PSEA, and I'm going to use that term for preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, is an important issue for private security companies. How were the guidelines put together? What are the main lessons that came out of the process? And some of the main kind of themes that emerged.
Thank you, Chris. With regard to why PSEA is important for private security providers, I guess first of all we should go back to the language of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, where it is clearly stated that all companies, and not only private security companies, have a responsibility to act with due diligence to avoid infringing on human rights and in case this infringement exists, to address the adverse effect. This is even more important for ICoCA member companies because at the moment private security companies join the association, they commit to comply with the requirements of the International Code of Conduct. And this code contains at paragraph F, at section F, specific human rights, humanitarian law requirements, and at paragraph 38, a specific provision on sexual exploitation and abuse and gender-based violence, which means that all ICoCA member companies have to comply with this requirement. They have to properly identify risks, manage these risks adequately, but also have a duty to be transparent with the association with regard to what actions they have taken and the results they have achieved. And then finally, it is important because we see more and more clients paying attention to PSCA, mentioning PSCA even in contracts, and mentioning the fact that their contractors' failure to address sexual exploitation and abuse is deemed ground for termination of contractual agreements. So this means that companies that tolerate SCA or that might fail to address it might not only face legal consequences, but also face a reputational damage, which means that they are ultimately not able to implement the contracts they already have and not able to secure new contracts. Regarding the process that has led to the application of the guidelines, as an association, we started working on this last year because this is part of our mandate to raise private security industry standards and to build the capacity of member companies, but also because of the recent events you mentioned before and the following campaigns that have raised everybody's awareness on why it is important to address this issue. The nature of the association is multi-stakeholder, so we adopt a multi-stakeholder approach in developing the guidelines, meaning that we consulted with member companies, first of all, to understand their needs, their expectations, but also with observers, with member governments, the UK, the US, Canada is here, and civil society organizations to reflect international best practices in the guidelines, and with external experts. This ultimately led to the publication of the guidelines, which is a living document, meaning that it might be expanded or updated in the future, and is part of a broader project, which also includes the development of indicators and the launch in the next few weeks of a company self-assessment, which will contain a section on sexual exploitation and abuse. And it means that companies will be able to assess themselves whether they are doing enough or not in this sense. So there is an element of capacity building and an element of assessment, which covers the entire membership cycle of companies. With regard to the lessons learned, I guess I would mention probably two main lessons learned. The first one is that when I approached the topic, and because I'm myself quite new to this topic, I mainly thought of private security providers as potential perpetrators. While the more and more I consulted people, I realized that it happens often that private security providers, private security personnel are themselves victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. I remember the case of this company telling me that in the context where they operate, it's not unlikely that private security personnel, especially when they are women, get harassed while commuting from home to work and vice versa. So because of that, the company has decided to provide door-to-door transportation to their guards when they are on night shifts, which I believe is a good practice. And the second lesson learned, which is connected the first one is that it is not only an external issue, meaning it doesn't only happen in relation with local communities, but it also happens internally. Especially it happens during recruitment, and when you have people who are desperately looking for a job and are marginalized, are vulnerable. It might happen that recruiters might take advantage of this situation, might abuse of their power to request applicants sexual favors in exchange for employment. And finally, about teams, I guess the main theme that has emerged during our research has been the fact that it's not enough to adopt policies, no matter how good they are, but what is important is the regular implementation of these policies, is creating a safety culture. And this is also related to the fact that most of the abuses that happen within organizations and companies and other entities do not get reported because this culture doesn't exist, and people fear that if they report, they might lose their job or suffer any other form of retaliation. Another theme is the importance of selection and vetting, the importance of screening applicants and making sure that companies recruit the right profiles for the job. And finally, the importance of training, both at the moment of deploying personnel before deployment and on a regular basis afterwards, to make sure that companies create expectations, raise awareness, but also maintain this awareness over time.
Great, thank you. So Frank, I want to turn to you. You run a private security company in Ghana, and your company was one of the ones that was kind enough to provide some input into the guidelines. So why is this an important issue for you and your company? And how do you approach PSEA as an issue? Looking at the guidelines themselves as well, it'd be good to kind of get your sense of what the implications of these are for private security companies in kind of implementing them. And if you could give us a broader sense of what the needs and challenges of the industry in Ghana and beyond are on this issue, that would be great too.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thank you so much for inviting us to this important conversation. I think that for us as a private security company, anytime that a client reaches out to us, we strongly believe it is because they are looking for some form of protective services and strongly have a confidence in our operations to deliver a comprehensive package of services. Therefore, we actually have a technical and moral obligation to provide all of those services in an uncompromised manner. And I say uncompromised manner because there are a lot of things that weaves into the conversation. In order for us to do this, we also are very sensitive to the needs and employ acceptable work ethics to deliver. You realize that, in terms of ethics, this is actually key in acknowledging and admitting the fact that these are problems that exist that needs to be addressed one way or the other. At a company level, one of the things we have done is to ensure that, inclusive of top-level management, employees, and even our supply chain partners, we all work together to take all the necessary means to reduce the risks of sexual exploitation and abuse in line of duty. This is because it's inclusive, so that everybody understands and appreciates the role they play in getting around this conversation and making sure that these abuses do not happen in the first place, and if they do happen, there are some mechanisms in place to address them. More specifically to landmark security, we have actually invested so much time and attention in promoting gender balance and women's empowerment. That's a key strategy to dealing with ESEA at the company level. Example, and I think I made mention of this when I received the team in Ghana. Our HR manager, for instance, is a lady, because we think that when you have them at the forefront of some of this conversation, it helps in terms of having the confidence and trust in reaching out and being able to address some of the issues. If it's a male-dominated sector, like we all know, tendency that women, female, would not have that trustworthiness to move to that space to have that report in place is also something that needs to be looked at. And so for that reason, we have them in leadership positions and they've been empowered sufficiently enough to make the decisions as we move forward. And also coupled with the fact that our board of directors actually demand of us the implementation of stronger measures to detect, control, and prevent abusive behaviors of any kind. And this is of any kind. It is not necessarily about prevention of sexual exploitation, but any abusive behavior that tends to affect the reputation of the company as we operate. In the unlikely event that it does occur, over the years we haven't reported any of those things, but in the unlikely event that it does occur, and one of the things we have in place is to have a support system to be able to support the victims to ensure their safety and well-being. So I think more generally and specifically from our end, these are some of the things we are doing. But in terms of the broader need, in terms of the challenge that the industry is facing in Ghana and how that relates to PSEA, from our experience, I must also admit that a lot of times you realize that private security companies are actually operating in areas of fragility where state capacity is low and in circumstances of heightened risks, including sexual exploitation and abuse. Therefore, we think that private security company management, who are probably at the top of the food chain, should be able to, in an active way, engage in this whole conversation. And I think that at the industry level, ICoCA, you've taken the lead, you've come up with these standards and guidelines, which for me, I think is going to help us in moving forward to addressing this issue holistically. We need to also have a look at the recruitment and engagement policies that we have in place. And one of the conversations I had, I said, we need ICoCA to provide that support for companies to be able to come up with systems that are more validated in a way. So we're able to provide the services in a more ethical and moral way to our clients. When you speak or when you look at vetting and screening, for instance, how are employees screened? How are they vetted? Is there any screening mechanism in place to ensure that it's an ongoing process rather than a one-time activity? How are you able to pick out those who have history of sexual abuse from your team and be able to address the concerns in a more structured way? And thanks for addressing the issue about training. I think training is also key. At the industry level, we realize that there's so much that needs to be done. And so you get a call from a client who needs some specific service to be done. Are we in a position to be able to provide the full complement of training that would ensure that the team that are deployed on the field are able to acknowledge this, work within the confines of the framework that has been designed for us? Last but not the least is also to look at how we encourage victims to report and provide secure avenues for victims to anonymously, if they require so, and freely engage company leadership without fear of victimization. That has been one of the things that usually comes up. So even though people are abused, there's also the tendency for them not to report because of victimization, etc. More specifically to Ghana, I think we are more fortunate in a way because we have a lot of these laws and this test woven into a lot of the policy or a lot of the legislation we have in there. I mean, unquestionably, every society has some form of practices that may be discriminatory. A lot of times, we don't realize there aren't sufficient laws or regulations to holistically address them. But in the event that they do exist, it perhaps not fully implemented or enforced due to systematic challenges or pure neglect of the importance of such issues. So for us in Ghana, for instance, at the governmental level, what we expect or what we are working with the government to do is to ensure that we decentralize the process so as SOPs, for instance, are designed at the local level so the local government authorities are able to work with the private security companies to ensure that we understand what the SOPs are, we understand what the laws and the regulations are, and we are able to design our operations to fit within the broader scope of the regulations. I mean, and just to be more specific, the Labor Act of Ghana at 651, I think, which was actually promulgated in 2003, with some applicable legislative instruments, actually provides a framework for looking at some of these issues. Prohibition of all forms of exploitation, including XCA, sexual exploitation, and also human trafficking, for instance, which has specific issues on sexual exploitation, is also one of the things that is in there. So we have the framework. What is left for us now is the implementation and how we're able to work with all the actors. In Ghana, I think we have about 2 or 3 companies who are actually signatories to the ICoCA, who are actually putting in enough measures to be able to accept some of these standards. We've come a long way, but I think there's still more that needs to be done to create the awareness, to engage the communities that we are serving, so they'll be able to recognize some of these issues when they come up, and to be able to have an open dialogue with them, and also have a form of reporting that they're able to reach out to authorities where the need arises. I would like to conclude by saying that we also have some expectation from ICoCA to work more broadly with the industry, and also to engage government at the highest level to create that demand and acceptance. Because I think that once the demand is created, then we, the private security component, honestly don't have a way out. We have to ensure that we are playing by the rules, because then the demand is there, and the governments are going to be able to enforce those ones, because they have all the mechanisms in place at the lower level to enforce some of these things. So I'll probably yield now, and then we see how it goes. And if there are some questions that are specific to our operations, I can address them as we move on. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Frank. That's really enlightening. I did have one little follow-up question, which is you mentioned the board, and that you know, they've kind of played a significant role in this. Why is that?
So I think it's key because, you know, I mean, for instance, if I'm a chief executive officer of the company, we usually say everybody has a boss and everybody reports to somebody. So if you don't get the buy-in of the board, then it becomes difficult for you to implement some of the mechanisms that you might have in place. Some might involve financial contributions, and you need a sign-off from the board. And you also need the board to actually understand that this is an important topic that needs to be addressed. It's not only about the bottom line, it's also about the reputation and how that influences even the clients that actually reach out to you for you to provide them services. So for me, I think that is key. If you get the board involvement, it makes it easy for you to roll out some of these processes and activities at the lower level.
And what kind of influence has been there to play on the board themselves, the board members? What's been influencing them to pressure the company to go in this direction?
I mean, it's more of something that everybody now admits and accepts that it has to be addressed one way or the other. It is not like one of those issues that, you know, previously we might have overlooked some of these things. But looking at how things are moving and the trends, these are things that are part of the mainstream. It's part of the agenda setting. The agenda has been set, and if you're a company, you have to also ensure that you are addressing some of these things. I'm sure in the next couple of months or years, we'll end up with companies that will demand to see specific SOPs that you have developed as a company to address some of these issues at the operational level. And so you realize there's a concern. If you don't address it, then unfortunately times will pass by you, but you need to address them if you still want to continue to operate in a safe environment and provide that leverage for people to have that confidence in the operation.
Great, thank you. And I think that kind of reflects a conversation that Lisa and I were having just earlier about how the conversation does seem to have changed, you know, within the last couple of years, certainly. So Lisa, kind of turning to you now, you head up the European Interagency Security Forum, representing over 100 aid agencies internationally. Could you tell us a little bit about the work of EISF? In particular, there's a guide that you've also kind of recently produced on managing sexual violence against aid workers themselves. But also just kind of more broadly, what lessons have been learned within the humanitarian sector on these issues? Are they relevant to private security companies and their clients, not just working in the humanitarian field, but in other areas as well?
Thank you. Certainly a lot of what Frank was saying, I recognise there's definitely overlap and learnings between the sectors, but there are similarities as well as differences. As EISF, we act as a network for the global security focal points within the organisation. So it is very much looking internally around staff safety and security. But with some of the statistics that have been gathered in our sector, one of them is 69% of victims know the attacker. So the perpetrators are inside the organisation. So a lot of the lessons are going to be applicable to your own staff, but also to people beyond the organisation itself. Some other statistics that may be of interest: 1 in 3 women will suffer from some form of unwanted sexual harassment or violence during their life. Of all of the people who have been subject to sexual assault of some kind, this is within sort of the humanitarian sector, it's believed only about 17% have bothered to file a complaint for various reasons. And of those 12%, of those 17%, 12% were men. And I think this is the other thing we need to be aware of, is although the majority of cases are against women, we need to remember that we shouldn't be making these assumptions, and that the systems we put in place need to think about the diversity. Chris, you started by mentioning the scandal that rocked the aid sector, and obviously as somebody within the sector, I think often the coverage was rather sensationalised, and I don't think we're any worse than any other sector. But it did prove useful, because we've been struggling to get the whole topic of sexual violence on the table. And again, as Frank was saying, getting it up to board level to take it seriously. And we were really struggling. And the positive side of this action is that it really is now front and centre in the agenda for aid agencies, which is great, because it means that we're now getting some of the resources we need to be able to tackle the problem. We were looking at what was the reason that we couldn't get it on the agenda and up to board level. And one of the things that we found was it's about people are not aware of the extent of the problem. And part of this was about how it was reported. Incidents, security incidents such as crime or from terrorism or road traffic accidents, get reported through an incident register, they go up, people at board level will look at the sort of things which are impacting staff. Incidents that are around that power imbalance you were talking about tend to be reported through the human resources side of an organisation, and therefore don't appear on the incident lists. So a lot of the time, the senior management were just unaware of the extent of the issue, because it was being reported through 2 different approaches. People don't know what to report. Giuseppe mentioned the example of women being harassed on their way to and from work. And a lot of the time, we've got examples of this. People think, well, it's outside office hours, so I don't report it. So more awareness around what people should be reporting, I think is really key. But the other area around reporting, while it's absolutely essential that you have good systems in place for people to have confidence to report the major incidents, we do need to find a system for reporting the minor incidents as well. Because if your organisation has a no tolerance policy, if somebody is just behaving a bit inappropriately, the misogynistic jokes, inappropriate touching, you may not want to get them sacked, but you do want somebody to talk to them about their behaviour and to give them a warning and change it. And this is one of the things we've been looking at with a number of organisations, is that 2-tier reporting system. I think the UN has something similar to this. And the reason why we find it so important that we all get those minor incidents reported is if you look at what's sort of called the triangle of incidents, if you want to reduce the number of the really serious attacks, you've got to reduce the foundation of minor incidents and harassment, etc., that is built on. And this really links to a lot of the work that particularly a lady called Catherine Plumridge in our sector was looking at, which is around the enabling factors, what creates an environment in our sector and the environments we work, which really allows perpetrators to continue to get away with these sorts of incidents. And some of the factors that we identified is a lot of the places we work, and I think the same goes for private security providers, are very paternalistic and hierarchical societies. There's very limited rule of law, and in many of the contexts we work, even where there is rule of law, they may actually persecute the victim as being at fault rather than the perpetrator. Poor policies and procedures within the organisation, and just long-term misogynistic behaviour patterns. And I think this is again where we see often an overlap between the NGO staff and the private security providers, is in the social setting, in these high-risk environments, we're going to the same bars, we're at the same parties, and you get this often, the proportion of men to women is much greater than in normal society. So it's creating, again, an environment which can make the perpetrators feel safe to behave in such a way. And one of the worrying things is, you know, if alcohol doesn't work, we're seeing a frightening increase in the use of drugs in the environment. Another area that we've really been looking at, because of this sort of enabling factors, this enabling environment, is the bystander phenomena. You know, and it's not just giving the confidence to victims to be able to speak up and say this is wrong, but really empowering people to speak up if they feel their colleagues are behaving inappropriately, if they're feeling somebody's making others feel uncomfortable. And the bystander phenomena is the bigger the group you're in, the less likely any individual is to say something. So how do we really empower people to say something, to make a difference, to actually change these underlying behaviours in the areas we work? And I think I'd just like to end on a point which I found really very worrying, is when the aid sector really started looking at this issue, and because we've been looking at it for a while, we've been working on this guide for a couple of years now around managing sexual violence. I tried to engage with a number of these groups, saying, you know, we've done this already, you don't need to start from scratch, there's learnings we can build on. But I was kept out, and I found this quite bizarre, and I spoke to a few people about it. And what I was told was it was because many people see security as part of the problem and not part of the solution. The security staff, and I think this goes back to these perceptions that we're talking about around the environments where we work, as such that there is a concern that security staff are actually adding to the problem, not the solution. And I think this is a really interesting debate, and the work that is being done by ICoCA, sorry, I mispronounced that, apologise, to change this and to really work on the perception and make us part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
So that's fascinating. Perhaps Lorraine, governments play a role in that. You know, if you could just expand on what you see the role of states promoting PSCA so that they do become part of the solution rather than the problem, both as regulators and clients actually of private security companies, and specifically what's the Canadian government's approach to this issue? Are there any action plans, relevant kind of regulatory actions Canadian governments take?
Okay, sure. I'd be happy to set some of that out for you. And I think before I do that, I think what I'll do is put it all in context, because I think how we are as a client, as a regulator, is informed by kind of the key themes that we stand for. For Canada, prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse is very important, and it's also important because it comes under a broader umbrella of our feminist foreign policy, our feminist development policy, how we look at implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, how we look at implementing our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, and how all those things kind of come together to be the backdrop through which we engage on PSCA. I'm going to use the acronym. So, I mean, we focus on some of the existing gaps, the gaps that have all the speakers have so far identified. But then, how do we shift the culture? How do we leverage collective engagement with other donors across various fora? And so, I won't take a huge amount of time, but I will just list some of the different fora that we're working on. I did mention international assistance, but also in the UN system. The UN system, we use the definition from the UN in terms of SEA, and so we are engaging on that level. Also, other multilateral platforms, and ensuring that our internal house is in order. I'll say a few words about that in a few moments. And then look at how do we address general human rights and PSCA in relation to Canadian corporations abroad. And so within the UN system, we provide advocacy support, whether it's through consistently raising it, through UN development system, governing bodies, those organizations that are in these complex environments, whether it's UNOPS, UNICEF, UNDP, etc., or whether we're working at a higher level with the Secretary General in terms of the Compact on Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, which we signed on to in 2017, or whether we're looking at financial support in terms of that we give to the Office of the Special Coordinator on SCA or to the Trust Fund in support of victims of SCA. And then there's also the substantive support that we provide, whether it's to providing substantive comments, for example, to the ICoCA guidelines, whether it's sharing best practices and capacity building with other donors, whether it's being a party, working with under UK local leadership on a working group on PSCA, or as I mentioned, in multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the IESC Plan of Action. We've been supporters since the beginning in 2002. And it's part of some of the expectations that we put on anybody who wants to be an implementing partner for the Government of Canada in terms of development aid, but also in terms of how we approach our companies abroad. And so the approach that we use is we don't use the word compliance. It's an expectation of responsible business conduct abroad. And so the expectation is that our companies, when they are working anywhere in the world, will respect human rights, that they will respect all applicable laws, international standards, and to meet the the highest standards that are out there. And that does include mitigating risk, like mitigating the risk of PSCA. How do you identify it? How do you prevent it? And how do you mitigate, as I mentioned before? And this is all in light of the UNGPs, the guiding principles, whether it's on the voluntary principles on security and human rights, or the OECD guidelines. So we kind of use all those multi-stakeholder apparatus, if you will, to anchor that kind of expectation and the approach that we have for Canadian companies. And so you asked, what do we do as regulators? So as regulator, there's kind of a dual approach. The first is that in addition to the expectation, we do have some voluntary dispute resolution mechanisms. So for example, if there were cases or allegations of PSCA, it could come through some of those dispute resolution mechanisms, whether it's the national contact point, through the OECD guidelines, or whether it's through our newly established Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprises. She was appointed on April 8th. Her name is Sherry Mayer-Hoffer, and her mandate will be, I'm going to read this part, there's several different aspects to it. And the first is to monitor implementation of the recommendations that are made, report publicly throughout the process. And also, she would be able, as ombudsperson, to review any allegations of human rights or SCA including incidents on or around a Canadian company's operations that are undertaken by security personnel. And so that's where the issue of, not only Canadian companies abroad regulating their activities, but also them as clients for private security companies as well. That would fall under her mandate as well. And also we, as clients, promote the Mantra document, of course. We promote ICoCA. And we also, in our public bidding processes, we provide additional points to those who have ICoCA membership. It's not a requirement, but in the process, they get additional points. And so we're confident that they've gone through the certification process, and hopefully they will be following the guidelines such as PSCA to make sure that there's that extra level of protection, and we have that confidence that they will be adhering to the highest standards that we expect. And then we also go through significant security vetting provisions. So for Global Affairs Canada, we ensure that selected security providers are determined on suitability, and that includes human rights screening. It includes many of the things that are set out in the guidelines. So whether it's background checks to determine have there been past proven allegations, have there been dishonorable discharges, because we don't want to have a circulation, and in the past we've seen that the circulation of violators going from duty station to duty station or location to location and being rehired. So that's something that we take seriously, and we put that in place as well. And I think one of the things that I'm going to end on, which was mentioned by a lot of the previous speakers, is that we also have to look at what are the benefits to the clients, and as a client too, as a government, we have to make sure that that's clear what the expectation is, but also to show, to kind of make sure our internal house is in order. And as I did mention, we've established a PSCA unit within Global Affairs that's able to accept complaints if there are complaints in terms of the context, mainly in the development sector, for implementing partners if there's allegations. While we would expect and hope that they would do their usual reporting, but also there is a unit within the government of Canada that can accept those allegations as well. So we are putting in a reporting system, and we think it's really important for that to be done through for our companies and as clients to the PSC.
Thank you. And I mean, I think the client piece is really key there. Certainly, it's something that we ICoCA have been kind of thinking a lot about as well. What's come up a little bit in the conversation as well is the kind of resource issue. It does take resources and investment of time to raise standards. But maybe thinking of this holistically in a kind of supply chain way, this is shared responsibility. I don't think it can all come down to private security companies. Clients have a role to play as well, and others. But I do want to turn, we're getting lots of questions in, and so we will try and cover as many of these as we can in the time we have available. The first one is from Caleb Wanga. How do we ensure that self-assessment is effective when legal regulatory framework is weak in most countries? Chance of associations behaving like workers' unions is likely to happen in order to protect each other in the face of human rights violations. Companies are likely to cover each other. Does anybody want to take this one on?
I can take it.
Okay.
When I referred to the self-assessment, I referred to the ICoCA company self-assessment system. And I understand some of the concerns that Caleb is raising, because I believe that if self-assessment is not complemented by other measures, there is a risk that it is ineffective. At the ICoCA level, we ensure effectiveness because we also have other measures in place to assess company performance and compliance with the requirements of the International Code of Conduct. We conduct field visits. We certify against the standards of the code. So this is how, at the ICoCA level, we ensure that self-assessment is effective. At state level, probably I'm not the best person to respond, but I believe that is a case-by-case analysis that needs to be conducted, because each context might be different and might have some peculiarities. So we cannot talk about the world as a uniform environment.
I mean, I think coming from a state as regulator perspective, there are a few things that can be done to complement the self-assessment. So for example, I did mention that we do have the voluntary dispute mechanisms. However, if there are companies that refuse to cooperate, there are repercussions. And one of those things is the removal of trade advocacy support from those companies that don't cooperate. And in many contexts, that's really important. And they do rely on our trade commissioner services to assist in finalizing, getting entree into for the contracts, et cetera. So that's one. I mean, we use both the carrot and the stick as well. And I think despite, I mean, you have to look at the reputational, but you also have to look at increasing operational costs as well. And I think that's one of the factors that as a regulator, we can make sure that those things are in place so that it's not just self-assessment, but there's also things to prop that up to make sure it's effective.
Frank, do you have any kind of views on this as a security company yourself?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we complain and talk about the fact that there are weak legal regulatory frameworks, but I think there would always be issues with the weakness of the regulatory framework or the legalities and all of that. But that shouldn't take away the fact that we as company or private security companies and leadership should have an appetite to probably do what is right and have an interest in doing what is right. I think for me, that is the key thing. So you might not have the regulations in place, but if you have that appetite, then it helps you to move on to the next stage. So you might probably have issues with or challenges with prosecution when probably you need to move through the full phase. But I'm sure the legal people would be able to address that at the broader context. But obviously and ultimately, there should be an appetite to do what is right. So irrespective of whether there's a framework or there's no framework, what is right would always stand as what is right. And we shouldn't let there's a perfection be the enemy of good in a way. So we should look at it more from what we can do as an industry player or what we can do as top level managers within industries to ensure that these things are not or are more contained in a way so it doesn't spiral out of control.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Tina Tendon, and we've touched on this in a number of the kind of interventions that we've had. So the question is, how can security across ensure that survivors of SEA can report safely and in their own language to complaints mechanisms staffed with people who are trained on handling or at least referring cases of gender-based violence? So this touches on gets to the root of the kind of creating a safe environment for reporting. How do we do that?
I'll have a go. It's not easy, and I think what we see is a lot of the times systems are designed for internationals without really thinking about the national staff. Certainly with a couple of organisations I've spoken to about, one of the issues was who do you report it to? And even and particularly when there's issues of confidentiality, even who then reports it up can identify who made the initial report. So organisations have created committees so that they can be reported to somebody in the committee, but it's then the committee that makes the report onwards, so that there's no identification of the individual who has reported it. And I think finding ways and means, and I think of all the discussions we've had, there is no one size fits all. You've got to provide multiple different options that people can pick what suits them.
And I think you just have to make it practical. So for example, agencies or however it is. I mean, we have to think of practical means to bring the reporting apparatus to them. And we also have to realize what it takes to report and make sure the people that they're reporting to are qualified to accept those reports and to recognize somebody who may be in distress and may need psychosocial supports and other supports, and have referral systems, because I think you have to, if you're taking responsibility to take reports, you almost see, it's almost an expectation that you would have those referral systems in place as well. And so I think you have to take a holistic view of setting up a reporting system. It's not just having one person who's able to take the reports and dealing with confidentiality issues, but you also have to take a victim-centered approach in order to make sure it's safe for them, and that will encourage others to do it as well.
Frank, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Yes, I think the issue about translating into multiple languages is actually a major problem, and like Lisa said, because I mean, if you're operating in, let's say, Ghana, where you have about 19 official, like 19 languages, that I mean, it becomes more complicated for you. But of course, we use English as the medium of communication and all of that. So as a first step, we have that, but we also need to engage more with the communities. So they are very confident in the processes that we have in place in terms of anonymous reporting, for instance, so that when there's a need to do a follow-up, you can actually follow up specifically and address some of those concerns. So it's quite challenging, but I'm optimistic we can get there at the point. We might not have the full 19 languages, but at least we can start off from somewhere and build on that into the future.
Right, thank you. Now, I don't want to preempt the next question with an answer, but I do want to say that these guidelines are just a beginning. They're not necessarily intended as, you know, a comprehensive document, as Giuseppe mentioned. You know, they're a living document. But I do want to ask Simon Chorley's question, which is the UN Guiding Principles, specifically Principle 12, requires that companies pay particular attention to children. Yet I don't see any reference to children in the ICoCA PSEA guidelines. Please can you address how private security providers should respond to the specific risks and vulnerabilities faced by children, and how they can put in place specific referral mechanisms and support services for them? This is an important issue. Who would like to have a go? Giuseppe, I'm sure you'd like to say.
Yeah, I can start. Actually, I cannot respond, and that was, as Simon correctly notes, there is no reference to children in the guidelines. I said this is a living document, and what we are doing at the moment is exactly that, identifying new areas, for example, protection of children, on which we should consult with companies, with experts, with other stakeholders, and develop additional guidance. This will be based on the needs of companies and also on the expectations of clients and other stakeholders. So I think the question is very well put, and it's very timely, but I cannot respond in terms of what should they do. What should they do? The identification, what should they do, is our next step.
I'm certainly not an expert on this area, but what I have seen amongst our member organisations is those who have historically been children focused in a lot of the work and have existing child safeguarding measures developed have actually been leading the way on the PSEA as well. So I think there are some lessons out there which I'm sure they would be very happy to share that we can learn from the NGO sector.
And I would agree, because if you look at the definition, it's exploiting people vulnerability, and minors would be in these complex situations, would be, in my view, considered to be a person in a situation of vulnerability. And so the guidelines as they currently exist can be applied. I think the question is there expertise in order to implement them when you're dealing with minors? And so you may not need to start from scratch, but definitely, as you said, the expertise would be needed to ensure that the companies have the guidance they need in order to address specific needs of children.
And actually, when we drafted the guidelines, we understood that protection of children might require additional safeguards. And that's why we have not included that area, because you would have risk merging or creating confusion between different issues, where you might need to adopt additional safeguards. We need to make that clear, and we need to specify what safeguards you need to have in place, and that's why we decided to have more generic paper, and then something separate on specific issues.
And I think one thing that's also really important here is feedback from association members and others on this is just the start of the journey, and so we do need feedback and input and assistance on building these things out further. I want to go to the next question. When credible allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse come to senior management's attention, what factors should be considered when determining when external law enforcement authorities should be alerted and involved? Does the Canadian Ombudsman have any authority to hold companies accountable for human rights violations or to recommend bringing charges? And this perhaps brings up another issue which we discussed before the webinar between ourselves, which is the role of kind of protecting the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator, because in some environments there may be risks associated with reporting. But if anybody has comments on this, that would be great.
Just to speak to the ombudsperson, if I understood the question, it's whether or not they can make a referral for prosecution. It's not my understanding. It's mainly a fact-finding mandate that she has. Question. I think currently there are questions regarding whether that mandate will expand or not. But all of that to say that does not mean that the normal Canadian legal process is stalled. I mean, we have a robust legal legislative framework to which some of these can apply. So, some of these situations can apply. And so if there's a determination that there have been a violation of Canadian laws and regulations, then there could be prosecutions resulting from those. But I wouldn't necessarily link it to the role of the ombudsperson. It could result from the same set of factual situation, but it's not as though that is a prosecutorial office.
I mean, I think what I'd add, I mean, Lorraine made the comment earlier about a victim-centered approach. A lot of the time you have to take guidance from what the victim, survivor wants. Obviously, there are times when there are factors above and beyond what the survivor wishes for, but that has to be the starting point, really.
Sometimes you face problems where they report and say, "But I don't want you to do anything. I don't want you to tell anybody," and that could put the company at potentially at legal risk later on. So that's how do you deal with those situations, and how do you develop policies and processes that address or explain to in your communications, like what does it mean when you report, and make sure everybody understands what I don't want to use the word liabilities, the word me is jumping out, but what responsibilities come with being a source, a reporting source. Because you may have legal responsibilities depending on what jurisdiction you have to when somebody reports this to you that you must, especially if you're dealing with children.
Frank, I don't know if you have any interjection or
nothing more to add to what has already been said. But a lot of time we move those conversations to the legal team, who are more positioned to address some of these issues.
Well, thank you all. I am noticing, unbelievably, that it is 5 o'clock. We have many questions here that we have not unfortunately been able to get to. But thank you for thinking about this topic. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today. Thank you again to all our panelists. As I've mentioned, this is a kind of a continuous process. These guidelines are a living document. They're both reactive and proactive. And it's one of many guidelines that we want to develop here at ICoCA. Ultimately, the objective is to get companies to be more transparent and to raise standards, and together we can do that. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again for another webinar in the near future.